Americans like to think they have access to anything they crave, from stacked milkshakes to endless fast food chains. But the truth is, dozens of foreign foods remain illegal to import or sell in 2025. Some are banned for safety, some to save species, and some because of politics that sound ridiculous until you dig in. Over the next few minutes, you'll see examples of all three categories: health rules, conservation protections, and trade restrictions that still shape what ends up on American plates. And we'll start with a dish so tied to national pride that Scotland is still fighting for its return. Haggis, Scotland's lost dish. Imagine sitting down in Edinburgh with a plate of haggis, Scotland's national dish, only to find out that bringing it back to the United States is against the law. The recipe mixes oats, onions, suet, and sheep organs inside a stomach casing, boiled until it forms its dense, savory texture. But the part that makes it authentic is the very reason it can't cross American borders: sheep lung. In 1971, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued a rule that banned the use of animal lungs in food. Regulators argued that lungs can trap fluids, making them harder to inspect for safety. Because traditional haggis depends on lung tissue, the dish was automatically locked out of U.S. imports. It wasn't about taste or cultural judgment, just a federal rule that has never been revised. Over the decades, Scotland hasn't stopped pushing back. Several times, government officials have lobbied American authorities to reconsider, pointing to advances in food testing and food safety standards. Still, the FDA and USDA have kept the same position for more than 50 years, leaving the ban firmly in place. What Scotland sees as heritage, America continues to view through the lens of regulation. For Scottish-American families, that means substitutes. You'll find versions made with beef liver, barley, or even turkey giblets standing in for the missing lung meat. These replacements are legal and sometimes convincing, but anyone raised on the original will tell you it's not quite the same. Celebrations like Burns Night in the US often feature these workarounds, but the real dish stays on the other side of the Atlantic. Haggis shows how a single safety rule can erase a tradition from American tables. But not every food ban is about health regulations. Some are about protecting something far larger than a single recipe, entire species pushed to the brink by demand. Beluga caviar, luxury that's off the table. Beluga caviar may be the textbook definition of decadence, but in the United States, it has been off the market since 2005. That was the year the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service imposed a full import ban in response to collapsing wild populations of the beluga sturgeon, the immense Caspian Sea fish that produces these prized eggs. A single adult can grow longer than a pickup truck and weigh hundreds of pounds. Yet despite its size, the species became one of the most heavily exploited animals in the global food trade. The biology of the beluga makes recovery especially difficult. Female sturgeon often require decades before reaching reproductive maturity, and once numbers fall, the population takes many years to rebuild. Coupled with escalating demand for luxury caviar through the 20th century, that slow life cycle left belugas highly vulnerable. By the early 2000s, conservation groups were sounding alarms about steep declines, and regulators responded with the 2005 prohibition that remains in force today. That decision dampened, but did not eliminate demand. Smuggling networks still seek profit from a product that sells at especially high prices on the black market. Law enforcement continues to target illegal shipments with raids and seizures, treating the trade as a serious conservation issue. Chefs and importers caught sneaking it into menus risk significant fines and the loss of licenses. Despite the risks, prestige continues to make beluga caviar tempting for some buyers. For diners who prefer a legal path, alternatives exist. Varieties such as ostra and savruga remain available for import, and American aquaculture operations raise paddlefish roe and farmed sturgeon that mimic much of the texture and flavor. These options give consumers a chance to enjoy similar delicacies without threatening a species on the edge. Still, among aficionados, no substitute fully carries the cultural weight of beluga, whose scarcity has become part of its legend. It is one example of how U.S. regulation can reshape the foods that reach American tables. And in some cases, the restrictions don't involve wildlife at all, but centuries-old traditions of milk and cheese. Unpasteurized French cheeses. Few products are as tied to French culinary culture as raw milk cheeses. Roquefort, with its sharp blue veins, is one of the best-known examples, representing a tradition that values unpasteurized milk as the key to genuine flavor. But in the United States, many of these cheeses never reach stores because of a long-standing Food and Drug Administration rule. Cheeses made from raw, unpasteurized milk can only be sold or imported if they are aged at least 60 days. That limit is enough to keep some styles legal, but it shuts out many of France's soft, short-aged varieties. The reasoning centers on food safety. Regulators point to pathogens like Listeria and E. coli, which are more likely to survive in fresh, high-moisture cheese and pose greater risks to vulnerable groups such as children, older adults, and pregnant women. Hard cheeses aged beyond the 60-day mark generally pass inspection because drying reduces bacterial growth. But for soft, raw milk cheeses such as Brie de Meaux, Camembert de Normandie, and Epoisses, delicacies best eaten young, the cutoff is impossible to meet. As a result, many of the very cheeses that embody French craftsmanship never make it into American markets. Cheesemakers argue that pasteurization, while protective, strips away microbial diversity and the nuanced flavors that raw milk creates. Advocates say pasteurization reduces that complexity, while regulators maintain that public health outweighs artisanal character. This tension has been debated for years in both trade talks and food policy circles, but the FDA's stance remains firmly focused on risk reduction. In practice, American shops substitute pasteurized versions that imitate French originals but rarely satisfy those who know the difference. Travelers returning from France notice the gap most clearly. What is available at home is not quite the cheese they tasted abroad. And unlike some other banned foods, this restriction isn't likely to relax anytime soon. Sometimes, though, the reasons a food is missing from U.S. shelves have very little to do with safety. Instead, they come from rules about ownership, trade rights, and politics between nations. Mirabelle plums and trade wars. Mirabelle plums look like a simple golden fruit, but getting them in the United States is unusually difficult. Sweet, small, and more candy-like than most produce, they seem harmless at first glance. Their absence from American stores doesn't come from safety concerns or farming limits. Instead, it's a result of trade protections that turn this fruit into a controlled product. In France, Mirabelles are strongly linked to the Lorraine region. The European Union granted them a protected geographical indication, or PGI, meaning only plums grown in that area can be sold under the name Mirabelle de Lorraine. This makes the fruit both an agricultural product and a legally protected brand, because U.S. trade rules don't fully recognize that designation, and because market access is tied to broader agreements, commercial imports to America remain rare or restricted. Farmers in Lorraine retain guaranteed protection, but the price is that most of the fruit never leaves Europe. Trade negotiators have occasionally raised the issue of Mirabelles during larger agricultural discussions. The fruit itself is rarely the centerpiece, but it surfaces alongside broader disputes involving tariffs, subsidies, or labeling standards between the U.S. and Europe. As of 2025, no resolution has been reached that would open up legal retail imports. Compared to battles over steel or aviation, it might sound minor, but it illustrates how geographical protections and market rules can limit what appears in American grocery aisles. For bakers, the gap is obvious. Classic French tarts and jams often rely on the fruit's distinctive flavor, and without access to the real thing, substitutes like American plums or apricots stand in. These replacements echo the appearance but leave the taste lacking, a detail noticed by anyone who has eaten the Lorraine original. Occasional requests still reach specialty importers, but under current law they are unable to fill them. That leaves two options for an American enthusiast: grow a tree for personal use or travel to Lorraine during its short harvest season. Mirabelles serve as a reminder that not every absence on U.S. shelves is about safety. Sometimes, what's kept out has more to do with cultural rules and protected traditions, though in other cases, what's missing is far stranger and far harder to imagine eating at all. Casu Marzu, Italy's maggot cheese. Casu Marzu is one of Italy's most notorious foods, and it comes from the island of Sardinia. At first, it resembles a typical wheel of pecorino, but this version is left uncovered long enough for flies to lay eggs inside. The resulting larvae break down the cheese as they feed, softening the center into a spreadable paste. For Sardinian families who treat it as a delicacy, the process adds intensity and complexity to the flavor. For regulators, the same process crosses a line into unsafe handling. The presence of live insects is the main point of dispute. Health officials argue that allowing larvae to remain inside creates too many hygiene uncertainties, from possible bacterial growth to the risk of contamination during consumption. Supporters see those larvae as essential to the tradition, but under food standards, the product looks like an obvious warning sign. Regulators highlight both the unsanitary conditions of intentional infestation and the unpredictable nature of leaving a living organism to work on dairy. Because of this, Casu Marzu falls outside EU hygiene rules, making it illegal to sell commercially even within Italy. Families in Sardinia are still allowed to produce and share it privately, keeping the tradition alive on a smaller scale. Internationally, agencies continue to cite it as a clear example of a product too far outside modern food safety codes. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration has long treated it as prohibited, grouping it with other insect-related foods that cannot be imported or sold. Yet the ban has only added to its reputation. Visitors to Sardinia often seek it out in person, documenting themselves tasting the wriggling cheese and sharing the footage online. Interest from abroad tends to revolve as much around shock as around culinary curiosity, which explains why it continues to generate the same mix of fascination and disgust. While legal substitutes exist for other banned foods, there is nothing comparable to Casu Marzu, leaving its reputation as one of the rarest and most controversial cheeses firmly intact. Other bans come not from hygiene, but from the way animals themselves are treated, where the method of harvest raises as many objections as the product on the plate. Shark fin soup. Shark fin soup has long been seen as a status dish, especially at weddings and banquets in parts of Asia. The broth carries most of the flavor, but the fins give the soup its texture and prestige. In the US, though, the presence of shark fins is treated as a serious offense. State and federal measures from the 2000s through the 2020s have sharply limited their trade, driven by concerns about cruelty and conservation. The controversy rests on how the fins are obtained. Fishermen often cut them off live sharks and discard the bodies, a process called finning. Without their fins, the animals can no longer swim properly and quickly die. The practice has been condemned by marine biologists and animal welfare groups worldwide. In response, the US created a patchwork of restrictions. Federal rules targeted imports and sales, while many states, beginning in the early 2010s, introduced their own ban. By the early 2020s, congressional efforts, including the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act, had built momentum for a nationwide end to the commerce. Enforcement has grown tighter in recent years. Agencies have reported more seizures and criminal cases tied to fin shipments, often linked to smuggling routes that serve overseas buyers. Even with laws in place, the international demand for shark fin soup sustains a black market. Conservation groups warn that unless international efforts align, US crackdowns will only address one piece of a much larger trade. From a biological standpoint, the case for restrictions is pressing. Global surveys show large-scale declines in shark populations over the last few decades, with several species now critically threatened. Regulators emphasize that protecting sharks helps maintain balance in marine ecosystems and reduces the pressure on species already struggling to recover. Inside the US, some restaurants offer imitation shark fin soup made with gelatin or mushrooms. These alternatives reproduce the texture without the controversy, but they lack the symbolism that gave the original its prestige. And unlike other restricted foods, the spotlight on sharks has made the ban almost unshakable. Yet not every American ban grows from conservation or cruelty. Some exclusions are shaped more by cultural values, where the very idea of eating a certain animal sparks resistance. Horse meat prohibition. In some countries, ordering horse steak is as ordinary as ordering veal or lamb. Markets in France, Belgium, and parts of Italy still sell horse meat without controversy. In the United States, the reaction is markedly different. Here, the proposal stirs strong emotions, and the debate has less to do with flavor than with what horses represent in culture. Legally, eating horse meat is not prohibited at the federal level. What blocks its availability is the practical barrier of inspection. Since the early 2000s, Congress has repeatedly withheld funding for USDA inspections at horse slaughter facilities. Without those inspections, plants cannot operate legally, no matter the demand. The result is a de facto ban. No domestic slaughterhouses exist, and no legal supply chain supports horse meat sales in the U.S. Imports remain negligible. And the combination of regulatory hurdles and cultural attitudes keeps the meat off American table. Supporters of the ongoing restrictions say this makes sense. Horses hold symbolic value in the U.S., from their image as companions in frontier history to their role in sport and recreation today. Unlike cattle or pigs, they occupy a cultural space closer to pets, and many Americans see the idea of eating them as unthinkable. Efforts to reopen slaughterhouses have surfaced more than once, but collapse quickly under public opposition, often facing protests before plans can even take shape. Elsewhere, the perspective is different. In regions of Europe and Asia, horse meat remains part of culinary tradition, sold openly and marketed as a leaner, healthier alternative to beef. Its texture and use span everyday meals and special dishes. But in the U.S., the stigma is too embedded, suggesting a horse-based dish at dinner here is more likely to start an argument than a meal. It's an example of how rules, culture, and emotion can combine to restrict a food that is perfectly legal elsewhere. And sometimes, what gets banned isn't meat at all, but something as unexpected as a piece of candy. Kinder surprise eggs. To outside visitors, hearing that the United States prohibits a chocolate egg can sound almost absurd. After all, chocolate is everywhere and toys are everywhere, so why not combine them? The product at the center of this rule is the Kinder Surprise egg, a hollow chocolate shell that hides a plastic capsule containing a small toy. In the US, this design has been classified as unsafe for decades. The problem isn't the chocolate or even the toy, but the fact that one is concealed inside the other. The prohibition comes directly from the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which bars embedding non-edible objects inside food. When that law was written, Congress had child safety in mind, seeking to prevent incidents where small parts could be ingested by mistake. Kinder eggs, which appeared much later in Europe, seem almost built to meet those concerns. Their candy shell tempts children while masking a capsule that can be opened into pieces small enough to swallow. That exact structure is what keeps the product on the FDA's list of banned items. Despite the clear rule, the eggs remain a common seizure item at U.S. borders. Customs regularly seize them from travelers who assume they're harmless souvenirs. Officials have confiscated thousands over the years, treating them seriously under the same standards they apply to other prohibited imports. Regulators consistently point to the law's wording. If food contains hidden non-edible parts, it fails inspection. By 2025, the official workaround is Kinder Joy, a variation designed for legality. Instead of using a hollow chocolate shell, it packages the sweet and the surprise on opposite sides of a single container. One half offers a dessert with a small spoon, while the other holds a separate capsule with the toy. This structure complies with U.S. law by keeping food and object apart. For American fans, it remains the only legal way to enjoy the brand, though some point out that the scaled-back version lacks the novelty of the original. Candy isn't the only familiar treat reshaped by U.S. regulations. The same approach has long transformed products drawn from spices and roots once common in American kitchens. Sassafras root ban. In the 1800s, sassafras root oil was a common household ingredient, used much like cinnamon or cloves. It flavored early versions of root beer, appeared in teas and candies, and even found a place in home remedies. Families often steeped the bark or root into hot drinks and relied on it as part of everyday cooking. For decades, the flavor was tied closely to American tradition until federal scientists raised concerns in the late 20th century. By the 1970s, FDA research had zeroed in on saffrol, the natural compound that gives sassafras its signature aroma. In lab studies, saffrol exposure was linked to liver damage and cancer in animals. As evidence mounted, regulators moved quickly. In 1979, the Food and Drug Administration officially banned sassafras oil and saffrol-containing extracts from being used as flavorings in foods and beverages. What had once been a defining taste of American soda fountains was, almost overnight, reclassified as a public health risk. The ban was specific to saffrol, not the tree itself. Sassafras still grows widely across the eastern United States and continues to play a role in herbal medicine circles. However, anyone selling products with sassafras must either strip out the saffron or carry warnings against ingestion. That regulatory line has left a sharp divide between traditional practices, where the root was prized, and modern standards, which now emphasize risk. Herbalists occasionally argue its benefits, citing digestion or wellness, but regulators maintain that the potential for harm outweighs its history. Commercial beverage makers found substitutes. Today, every American root beer recipe uses saffron-free flavorings to approximate the old taste. The shift preserved the drink itself, but erased the authentic link to the sassafras tree. What once symbolized a homegrown flavor now survives only in imitation. Sassafras shows how a single compound can reshape the fate of an entire food tradition. But not every banned ingredient is so subtle. Some restrictions involve fruits that look inviting yet conceal dangers that regulators refuse to overlook. Fresh Ackee fruit restrictions. Ackee is one of the few fruits that can be both a celebrated national ingredient and a regulated hazard. With its red pod and glossy black seeds, it looks like a tropical curiosity until you learn its risk. If eaten before the pod opens naturally, the flesh contains high levels of hypoglycin, a toxin that prevents the body from regulating blood sugar. In Jamaica, this condition is known as Jamaican vomiting sickness, a reaction that can cause severe illness and in rare cases be fatal. Despite that danger, Ackee remains at the heart of Jamaica's culinary identity. Ackee and saltfish is the national dish, served in homes, restaurants, and festivals throughout the country. Generations have passed down the knowledge of how to handle the fruit. Never force it open, discard the black seeds, and eat only the naturally exposed yellow flesh inside. This cultural experience has allowed Jamaicans to keep enjoying the fruit, even as regulators elsewhere continue to treat it with strict caution. In the US, the problem has always been ensuring consistent safety. Fresh Ackee cannot be imported, and the FDA has enforced that prohibition since the 1970s because there is no reliable way to inspect unopened pods for dangerous levels of hypoglycin. Customs agencies screen for it regularly, and seizures of fresh fruit in luggage or shipments underline that the rule is backed by active enforcement. From a regulatory standpoint, the risk of unpredictable toxicity outweighs the appeal of bringing fresh pods directly to market. What has emerged instead is a compromise. By 2025, canned and frozen Ackee products are permitted in the US, provided they have been processed and tested under approved international standards to keep hypoglycin levels within safe limits. These versions give American consumers the chance to try the dish legally, and they preserve Jamaica's ability to share its cultural staple abroad. Caribbean restaurants across the US depend on these imports, serving Ackee with saltfish in a way that reflects tradition while satisfying regulators. Other traditional foods face a different obstacle. Not plant toxins, but long-standing rules about which animal parts Americans can put on their plates. Black pudding bans. Black pudding often confuses outsiders with its name, but it isn't a dessert at all. It's a traditional blood sausage with deep roots in the United Kingdom and Ireland. A staple of cooked breakfasts, especially in Scotland, it's typically made from pig's blood, fat, oatmeal, and spices, creating a dense, savory texture. Some regional recipes also incorporate organ meats for added depth, including lungs, and that detail is exactly where American regulations step in. Since 1971, the Food and Drug Administration has enforced rules that prohibit the use of animal lungs in food products. Officials argue that lung tissue can retain fluids and contaminants that are difficult to inspect, making it impossible to guarantee safety. While not every black pudding recipe includes lung, traditional varieties that do are automatically excluded from US markets under this rule. This connection places authentic regional versions, like Stornoway black pudding from Scotland, which also carries protected geographical indication, PGI status, firmly off-limits to American consumers. Nevertheless, the dish survives in adapted forms across US communities with British or Irish heritage. Butchers and small producers make lung-free sausages that rely strictly on blood, cereal, and spices. These versions are legal and provide a reasonable substitute, though many enthusiasts note they clearly lack the depth of traditional blends. Purists summarize the issue simply. American versions remove disallowed ingredients. Authentic flavor is lost. For those who grew up eating black pudding abroad, the substitutes are familiar in texture, yet incomplete in essence. Cultural groups and food advocates have occasionally tried to carve out exceptions, arguing for the dish's heritage value. As of 2025, however, no such appeals have led to change. The federal regulation remains intact, and imports of lung-containing versions are blocked. For now, Americans who want to replicate the experience must rely on modified recipes or travel overseas to enjoy the genuine article. This isn't the only case where blood-based dishes run into U.S. restrictions. In other parts of the world, sausages aren't the format of choice,